Russian sabre rattling has reached fever pitch after President Vladimir Putin vowed to punish the West for boosting Ukraine's war chest with frozen Russian assets, and his Ministry of Defense released footage of sailors pressing the nuclear button in simulated drills with tactical nuclear weapons.
Kharkiv again, and this is a scene of yet We're in Kharkiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with what's been happening both in Moscow and with the G7 leaders summits. The G7 leaders have promised to give Ukraine $50 billion in a loan underwritten by frozen Russian assets and the interest payments on those frozen assets across the G7 countries. Now, President Vladimir Putin has today responded to that, calling it theft and insisting that that theft will not go unpunished. Essentially, what it means is a huge cash boost for Kyiv, which will allow the government of President Zelensky to continue to continue operating as it continues to resist that Russian invasion. And that money is on top of the significant investments from allies, principally the United States and the European Union, in terms of resourcing that fight against Russia. Now, the sign that this is concerning the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin's comments calling it theft and vowing that reprisal. And that reprisal, that threat of a reprisal, coming just days after the Ministry of Defense in Moscow released this footage of its troops carrying out what it called a non-strategic nuclear exercise. Non-strategic is the Russian phrase the Russians have used. That is essentially referring to tactical nuclear weapons, lower yield nuclear weapons. Moscow announced these drills itself in response to previous calls from Western capitals, from Western leaders, to both send Western troops to Ukraine and indeed to allow Ukraine to use Western weapons to target Russian soil. Now, we've seen Ukraine winning that argument. America has finally relaxed its position. It has allowed Ukraine to use some of its weapons to hit some targets on Russian soil, but there remain caveats, and President Biden has still maintained that whilst Kyiv can use American missiles to hit targets in the near abroad, if you like it, in the close to the frontier with Ukraine, he is still prohibiting Ukraine from using those weapons to hit targets in much deeper Russian territory. That debate is ongoing. One of the questions from last week was why now? Why has that change happened now? Partly to do with mounting Ukrainian pressure, also partly to do with the Russian offensive launched from Belgorod into Kharkiv around Vovchansk. The second thing I want to talk about today is the peace talks, planned peace talks happening in Switzerland over this weekend. Vladimir Putin putting forward his own version of what it would take for Moscow to announce a ceasefire, and that's effectively capitulation. And we also know that China is separately, quietly putting forward its own attempt at a diplomatic track towards finding a peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine. But effectively what you have is three parties almost at war over how to reach peace. 160 countries have been invited to the summit in Switzerland. We know representatives of some 160 thereabouts countries and organisations have been invited to attend the peace conference in Lucerne in Switzerland. About 90 countries, we understand, expected to attend, but Russia boycotting it. President Zelensky's conditions for peace, for any peace talks, is that Russia or rather conditions for peace is that Russia must withdraw all of its forces from Ukrainian territory. Vladimir Putin's put forward his version of what it would take for Russia to announce an immediate ceasefire. It is effectively total capitulation. He wants Ukraine to cede Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions immediately, to withdraw its forces and to renounce all ambitions of joining NATO. That seems extraordinarily unlikely. That would effectively require Ukraine to cede more territory than it has currently lost over the last 2+ years of this conflict. It would also require Ukraine to cede 2 regional capitals, the city of Kherson and the city of Zaporizhia, which the respective capitals of Zaporizhia province and Kherson province, which are both firmly currently in Ukrainian control. We also understand from a report by the Reuters news agency, based on conversations with diplomats in China, that Beijing has been encouraging countries where it wields influence to boycott the peace process, or at least the peace talks happening and due to take place in Switzerland. China, the People's Republic of China, we understand from that report, trying to gather support and momentum for its own peace process. Interesting that at the same time the G7 leaders have issued a draft communique calling on China to stop supplying Russia with dual-use military parts. You'll remember Britain called out Beijing for supplying what it said was lethal aid to Russia. The G7 using slightly different language, but the understanding seems to be that China continues to supply Russia with components, high-tech componentry and parts which are vital for its arms industry, for Russia's arms industry. These are dual-use parts, but parts which Russia needs in order to sustain its frontline forces, to build the ammunition, the missiles and the weapons which it is using to prosecute this war in Ukraine. China has for some time tried to play an almost neutral part, but as the war has progressed, it's become clearer and clearer that Beijing is sided with Russia. You'll know, of course, Vladimir Putin has made more visits to China than any other country since the start of this war, and China's support in many ways crucial for Russia's ongoing conflict. Although in terms of volume and in terms of lethality, it is Iran and North Korea that continue to provide the one-way kamikaze attack drones from Tehran and just huge volumes of ammunition shells from North Korea. The final thing we want to talk about today is what's happening around in rural Kharkiv province with that Russian counteroffensive. 2 things worth noting. Footage has emerged of some 24 Russian soldiers who appear to have been surrendered and been captured by Ukrainian forces amid claims that they had launched a failed attack on an industrial plant near Vovchansk, and suggestions that the Russian offensive has been getting bogged down. This was the Russian offensive from Belgorod into Kharkiv province, which opened up effectively a new front, or renewed an old front in the campaign. Russian state news agency TASS, interestingly, reporting that they believe there is a build-up of Ukrainian forces in that area and that Ukraine may be planning a counteroffensive. So that is something we'll keep a close eye on. When Russia launched that attack in Kharkiv province, it looked like an attempt to distract Ukraine's forces, to divert them from the east, from the fighting in the Donbass, particularly around places like Chaziv Yar, which is adjacent to Bakhmut, and Avdiivka, which had been the focus and continue to be the main focus of Russians' offensives. We will keep an eye on whether there are indeed plans for or indeed whether we see evidence of a Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, if you're watching on YouTube and you've got any questions, please do write them in the comments below and we will endeavour to answer them next time. Loads of comments, really great response from last week, so thank you for that. The first thing, lots of comments from last week's video reminding us, making clear that Crimea is not sovereign Russian territory and that the Kerch Bridge is linking occupied Crimea to sovereign Russian soil. It was never my intention to suggest that Crimea is Russian territory, and I apologise if I gave that impression. It was misleading and it was not our intention. We understand that Crimea is occupied Russian territory. The strikes, this was in relation to the fact that Ukraine had launched strikes with ATACMS missiles at targets in and around Kerch. That was happening simultaneously with the evidence that America was on the cusp of, and we now know has rolled back or sort of softened its position and has allowed Ukraine to hit targets in sovereign Russia. But those are different things. Kerch, not sovereign Russia. Clearly targets such as in Belgorod are in sovereign Russia. Question number 2 was, how is this conflict affecting ordinary people in Russia, and why don't we see more reporting of that? It's a really good, fair question. The short answer is it's really difficult for us to tell, principally because we're not in Russia. I'm not in Russia. I'm banned from going to Russia. And in fact, there is very limited reporting and freedom of movement for journalists there. But from what we can gather, in fact, the impacts of this war, people are being shielded inside Russia from the impacts of this conflict. That appears to be the result of a deliberate Kremlin policy, both the very tight control of news and how this war is reported, and indeed attempts to limit their exposure to the front lines in terms of how people are affected, whether communities affected by this conflict. We saw in wars in particularly Russia's war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, that actually it was the mobilization of soldiers' mothers which really ultimately sort of changed the tide of public opinion against that conflict. That hasn't happened on the same scale. We have seen firebombing attacks against mobilization centers and conscription centers in Russia. We have seen Ukraine launching those successful attacks, drone attacks, against oil refineries and targets deep inside Russian territory. And that is an attempt both to bring the war home to people in Russia so they can see it and feel it. And that has also had an impact on oil prices and petrol prices inside Russia. So the war is having an impact, but we haven't seen large-scale protests or demonstrations against the conflict. Hard to know really where the tide of popular opinion in Russia sits on this conflict at the moment. And the final question was how would America accept Russian military bases in Mexico? And that clearly is an attempt to understand this conflict from the Russian point of view. Therefore, should Russia accept American military bases in Ukraine? Well, point number one is that America did not have military bases in Ukraine. In a simple answer to the question, would America accept Russian bases in Mexico? It would almost certainly cause a huge diplomatic and geopolitical incident. And of course, it has echoes of the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union tried to position nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba in America's backyard and ultimately backed down after sort of a fairly fraught moment of nuclear brinkmanship. The difference, of course, is that Ukraine is part of Europe and neighbours the European Union and neighbours Russia, whereas Mexico is the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So we're not talking about Europe or NATO projecting itself many thousands of miles. Ukraine is an adjoining territory, and crucially, Ukraine is a sovereign country which has expressed, particularly after this invasion, its desire to join both NATO and the European Union. And ultimately, this comes down to a recognition of Ukraine's right to sovereignty. That is a right which Moscow categorically denies. We hear Russia, we hear the Kremlin referring to the former Republic of Ukraine, suggesting it's not a real country, it's just a part of Russia, a limb that Russia has lost, which is seeking to regain. That is not how this conflict is seen inside Ukraine, where it's a country that feels like it has been violently and horrifically invaded, and Ukraine is fighting to repel those invaders. As ever, if you've got more questions, please write them in the comments below, and we will do our best to answer some of them next time.